The piercing, high-pitched shriek of the dialysis machine's primary alarm cut through the otherwise subdued, almost reverent hum of the Veterans Community Center's small, but absolutely vital renal care unit. It was a sound that always, without fail, sent a jolt of pure, undiluted ice through my veins, a primal, visceral warning of critical systems, failing of a life, a precious, hard-won life, potentially hanging precariously in the balance. Nurses, their faces instantly etched with concern, rushed towards Bay 3, where Sergeant Frank Peterson, a highly decorated, fiercely independent Vietnam veteran with a rapier wit as sharp as his mind was clear despite his failing kidneys, was undergoing his thrice-weekly life-sustaining treatment. His face, usually creased with a wry, knowing smile, even during the arduous, physically draining 4-hour sessions, was now contorted in a mask of sudden, agonizing pain, his breathing shallow, ragged, and audibly strained. Pressure drop. Critical pressure drop. And look at his O2 sats. A young, dedicated nurse named Maria, usually so calm and competent, cried out, her voice tight with a rising panic, as she pointed a trembling finger to the rapidly, terrifyingly declining oxygen saturation numbers displayed on Frank's bedside monitor. I was there, as I often was, on Wednesday afternoons in my capacity as a volunteer, a role I cherished a small way to give back to men and women who had given so much. Most weeks, I'd spend a few hours at the center, sometimes playing a fiercely competitive game of chess, with Frank other times, swapping stories and jokes with the other veterans, or often just lending a quiet, patient ear to anyone who needed to talk. It was a world away, a different universe entirely from my demanding high-stakes day job, my real job, a job that was far more consuming and infinitely less known to the generally oblivious residents of our meticulously planned, often fiercely territorial, and sometimes downright hostile Willow Glen Homeowners Association. To them, and indeed to most of the kind folks at the Veterans Center, I was just Mike Sullivan, a quiet, unassuming guy who worked in healthcare administration for some vague government agency. A man who kept to himself, paid his HOA dues on time, and occasionally brought in homemade cookies for the nurses. The truth, the carefully guarded truth, was that I was lead investigator Michael Sullivan, Office of Federal Health Compliance, a specialized division within the Department of Health and Human Services, tasked with ensuring the safety, efficacy, and integrity of medical devices, pharmaceuticals, and healthcare facilities across the nation. My specialty was complex medical device failure analysis and rooting out fraud and misconduct in federally funded healthcare programs. Frank gasped his hand instinctively, clutching his chest, his eyes wide with a mixture of pain and fear. The head nurse, a calm, incredibly experienced and unflappable woman named Brenda Washington, was already manually checking his vitals, her movements swift and sure, her voice barking out clear, concise orders. "Get the crash cart in here now. Page Dr. Ramirez, Stat Respiratory Distress Protocol. Someone double-check the machine's lines, pressures, dialysate flow." This was the hook, the horrifying, abrupt, sickening descent into chaos. Something was terribly, catastrophically wrong, not just with Frank, but with the dialysis machine itself. A state-of-the-art, gleaming Fresenius 5-8 Core Diax model that had been installed with much fanfare and gratitude only 6 months prior, as part of a significant federal grant to expand and improve renal care services for local veterans. The establishment of this small, dedicated dialysis unit within the existing Veterans Community Center building had been an absolute godsend for men and women like Frank Peterson. It saved them long, exhausting, often painful trips to the overcrowded county hospital, which was nearly an hour's drive away. It provided their life-sustaining treatment in a familiar, supportive, veteran-centric environment, surrounded by comrades and understanding staff. However, its very existence, its quiet success, hadn't been without considerable, often bitter friction. The community center building, while serving a broader public and technically owned by the county, was situated on land that was, through a complex and ill-advised historical quirk of zoning, technically managed by the Willow Glen Homeowners Association, and a vocal, powerful, and deeply resentful contingent within that HOA, led by the formidable and notoriously inflexible Ms. Eleanor Ainsworth, the HOA's long-serving iron-fisted and universally feared treasurer, had fought its establishment tooth and nail at every single stage. The inciting incident, Ms. Ainsworth's first official public salvo against the proposed dialysis unit, had come during a heated HOA board meeting, more than 2 months before the unit even opened its doors. "I must formally, and in the strongest possible terms, object," she'd announced, her voice like chipped ice, her gaze sweeping disdainfully over the assembled residents and the nervous-looking community center representatives, "to the proposed operation of this so-called Veterans Clinic on HOA-managed property. It is a clear, flagrant, and unacceptable violation of our community covenant's conditions and restrictions. Specifically, Article 7, Section B, Subsection 4, which explicitly states that all common facilities and grounds are for recreational, social, and approved community event use, only not for industrial medical purposes, not for the housing of complex, potentially hazardous machinery, and certainly not for the treatment of chronic infectious or otherwise undesirable ailments." She then launched into a lengthy vitriolic tirade about increased ambulance traffic, unsightly and potentially dangerous biohazard disposal bins, which were in fact discreetly located state-of-the-art and managed with impeccable federally mandated protocols, and the generally depressing and aesthetically displeasing atmosphere created by the regular presence of chronically ill individuals and their associated medical paraphernalia. Her disdain for the veterans themselves, men and women who had sacrificed for their country, had been palpable, barely concealed beneath a thin veneer of feigned concern for community standards. Her initial aggressive attempt to shut down the unit on arcane zoning technicalities and alleged CC&R violations had ultimately failed primarily because the land, while HOA managed for landscaping and minor maintenance, had a pre-existing ironclad county easement specifically designated for community health services, an easement that predated the HOA's existence by several decades. But her anger, her thinly veiled disgust for the very veterans the unit was designed to serve, had been palpable, a poisonous undercurrent in every subsequent HOA meeting. She saw the dialysis unit not as a vital lifeline for local heroes, but as a blight, an unwelcome intrusion on her personal vision of a perfect, pristine, aesthetically sterile, and utterly homogeneous Willow Glen. A Willow Glen where illness, disability, and inconvenient reminders of sacrifice were kept firmly out of sight. One afternoon, while playing chess with Frank, Brenda had commented, "You know, Mike, you seem to know a lot about these fancy machines, always asking such detailed questions. You sure you're just in administration?" I just smiled and made a self-deprecating joke about being a frustrated engineer. Now, watching Frank struggle for breath, his life literally tethered to that malfunctioning machine, a cold, sickening dread settled deep in my gut. This wasn't the first glitch these new, expensive machines had experienced in recent weeks. Far from it. Just last week, 2 separate treatments on 2 different machines had to be cut short due to unexpected, unexplained critical pressure fluctuations. The week before that, another machine had inexplicably overheated, triggering a system-wide shutdown and forcing a patient to be rushed to the county hospital mid-treatment. The manufacturer's certified technicians had been called out repeatedly. They'd blamed power surges from the aging community center grid, then faulty internal sensors, then a possible software bug in the latest firmware update. They'd replaced components, recalibrated systems, run countless diagnostics. But my instincts, honed by years of investigating complex medical device failures, often involving deliberate tampering or criminal negligence, were screaming at me that this was something more. Something far more sinister. This felt like sabotage. The rising action began with Frank's emergency hospitalization. He stabilized thankfully after a harrowing few hours in the ICU, but the incident sent shockwaves of fear and anger through the small, tight-knit community of veterans who relied on the Willow Glen dialysis unit. Fear became a constant, unwelcome companion to their already challenging, debilitating health battles. The dialysis unit's dedicated staff, led by the indefatigable Brenda Washington, were beside themselves with worry, frustration, and a growing sense of helplessness. They'd had the machines inspected, re-inspected, and then inspected again by the manufacturer's top field technicians, who, despite their best efforts, could find no definitive consistent cause for the sporadic, increasingly dangerous, and seemingly random malfunctions. The machines would pass all diagnostic tests, only to fail catastrophically, unpredictably, during a patient treatment. Ms. Ainsworth, meanwhile, was insidiously, almost ghoulishly active. In the latest Willow Glen HOA monthly newsletter, a glossy publication usually filled with gardening tips and reminders about trash can placement, she'd penned a lengthy, prominently featured, concerned residents' opinion piece. In it, she detailed with feigned regret the ongoing and troubling reliability issues at the veterans' dialysis unit, subtly poisonously suggesting that the unit was poorly managed, under-equipped, and ultimately a clear and present danger to its vulnerable patients. She conveniently, tellingly omitted any mention of her own previous strenuous and very public efforts to shut it down. Perhaps, she'd concluded, her prose dripping with false concern, it is time for the HOA board, in the interest of public safety and fiscal responsibility, to seriously reassess the long-term viability of hosting such a complex, demanding, and potentially hazardous medical operation on our community grounds for everyone's ultimate safety and peace of mind. Her campaign of attrition, her war of nerves was relentless, insidious, and clearly aimed at achieving through fear and insinuation what she had failed to achieve through direct opposition. The second shocking incident, the one that ripped away any lingering doubt in my mind about deliberate sabotage, occurred exactly 1 week after Frank's near-fatal collapse. Brenda Washington called me at home, her voice strained tight with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "Mike, you need to get down to the center. Now. You absolutely need to see this. Someone cut the main water intake pipe to the reverse osmosis system last night. The big one. The one that purifies all the water for all 3 dialysis machines. If the night janitor, old Mr. Henderson, hadn't noticed the flooding in the utility closet when he came in at 5 a.m., we could have started treatments this morning with completely unpurified, potentially contaminated water. It would have been catastrophic. Multiple fatalities, almost certainly." I rushed to the center, my heart pounding, a cold dread settling in my stomach. The damage was undeniable, blatant. A clean, deliberate, almost surgical cut through a heavy-gauge copper pipe, located in a locked, supposedly secure utility closet that now showed clear signs of forced entry. Pry marks on the door jamb, a shattered lock set. This wasn't a random act of juvenile vandalism. This was targeted, sophisticated sabotage, aimed at crippling the entire dialysis operation with a single, devastating blow. It was cleverly designed, perhaps, to look like an unfortunate, catastrophic plumbing failure to an untrained eye. But to a trained eye, to my eye, the malice, the calculated intent, was blindingly, chillingly evident. I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible residue near the cut, perhaps from a specific type of cutting tool. I discreetly took a photo with my phone, then wiped the area clean with a tissue from my pocket, which I then carefully placed in a small evidence bag I always carried in my briefcase. An old habit from my field days. My briefcase also held a few spare work ID badges just in case. That was the midpoint. The point of no return. Enough was unequivocally, irrevocably enough. The local police, when they arrived, were sympathetic, but clearly out of their depth. They were treating it as felony vandalism, possibly, by disgruntled youths, or perhaps a disgruntled former employee of the community center. The HOA board, when informed, wrung its collective hands, expressed shock and dismay, and talked vaguely about improving security patrols and installing more cameras. But they didn't truly understand the stakes, the deadly potential of what was happening, the sheer, calculated evil at play. I did. It was time for Mike Sullivan, quiet volunteer and government administrator, to step aside, and for lead investigator Michael Sullivan, Office of Federal Health Compliance, to take charge. That afternoon, as Brenda Mr. Henderson, the HOA president, a well-meaning but ineffectual man, not to be confused with the janitor, and a visibly shaken Eleanor Ainsworth, who had arrived expressing theatrical shock and outrage at this attack on our veterans, were surveying the damage in the flooded utility closet, I made my move. Brenda Mr. Henderson, Ms. Ainsworth. I began, my voice calm, but carrying a new, unfamiliar weight of authority that made them all turn to look at me surprised. This is not just vandalism. This is a federal crime. This is a deliberate attempt to sabotage life-sustaining medical equipment in a facility that receives federal funding and serves a federally protected population, our veterans. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my official gold shield and credentials, and held them up. My name is Michael Sullivan. I am a lead investigator for the Office of Federal Health Compliance, United States Department of Health and Human Services. What has been happening here, the repeated equipment malfunctions, the near-fatal incident with Sergeant Peterson, and now this deliberate act of sabotage, falls directly and immediately under our agency's mandate and federal jurisdiction. The shock in the small, damp utility closet was palpable. Brenda's eyes widened, then filled with a dawning, immense relief. Mr. Henderson's jaw dropped. Eleanor Ainsworth, however, went deathly pale, her carefully constructed mask of civic concern instantly shattering, replaced by a flicker of something that looked terrifyingly like raw, unadulterated panic. A federal team of forensic engineers and specialized investigators is already en route from our regional office. I continued, my gaze locking with Ainsworth's. They will be here within hours. Until they arrive, this entire utility area, the dialysis room, and all associated equipment and records are to be considered an active federal crime scene. Nothing is to be touched, moved, or altered in any way. Ms. Ainsworth, my voice hardened, given your well-documented, vehement, and persistent opposition to this life-saving unit, and your rather timely arrival here this morning, you will undoubtedly be a person of significant interest to my investigative team. I would strongly advise you to retain legal counsel, and I would also advise you not to leave town. Ainsworth for a moment seemed to rally. A flush of angry red crept up her neck. This is an outrage, an abuse of power. You can't just... I am the HOA treasurer. I have rights. This is HOA property. You have no jurisdiction here. I will be calling my lawyer. I will be calling my congressman. You do that, Ms. Ainsworth. I said, my voice like ice. But understand, this tampering with life-sustaining medical equipment, especially when it results in patient harm and involves federal interests, carries severe federal penalties. My agency, in conjunction with the FBI and the Department of Justice, takes such matters with the utmost seriousness. We have a zero-tolerance policy, and we have a very, very long reach. The climax of the investigation was a whirlwind of intense, around-the-clock methodical work. My team, a hand-picked group of the best medical device engineers, water purification systems, specialists, and forensic chemical analysts in the federal government, descended upon the Willow Glen Veterans Community Center like a force of nature. We meticulously, painstakingly examined every inch of the dialysis machines, the complex plumbing, the sensitive electrical systems, the water purification apparatus. We found microscopic tool marks on critical internal components of the machines that had glitched, clear indications that they'd been surreptitiously opened and deliberately expertly manipulated. We found trace residues of an industrial-grade corrosive solvent, known to degrade certain types of plastic seals and O-rings over time, near a critical flow valve in the machine Frank Peterson had been using. The cut water pipe was just the most blatant, most desperate act of sabotage. The earlier, more subtle incidents were clearly the work of someone who possessed a sophisticated understanding of how to cause intermittent, hard-to-trace failures. Someone trying to systematically make the unit appear unreliable, unsafe, and ultimately unviable. Someone trying to achieve through insidious sabotage what they couldn't achieve through legitimate channels. Suspicion, strong and immediate, fell squarely upon Eleanor Ainsworth. Her vocal, venomous opposition was a matter of public record. Her concerned residents' opinion piece in the HOA newsletter now reeked of malicious foreknowledge and cynical manipulation. We subpoenaed all HOA security camera footage from the community center grounds. Though much of it, particularly from cameras covering key access points to the utility areas, was found to be conveniently corrupted or offline due to technical difficulties around the specific times of the incidents. One grainy but usable shot from a camera covering a rarely used back alley behind the center showed a figure closely matching Ms. Ainsworth's build and distinctive gait, carrying a dark, heavy-looking tool bag near the utility closet access door on the very night the water pipe was cut. It wasn't definitive enough for an arrest on its own, but it was highly damnably suggestive. The final crucial piece of the puzzle, the piece that tied it all together, came from an unexpected and initially reluctant source. A disgruntled former HOA maintenance employee, a young man who had been summarily, and he claimed unfairly fired by Ms. Ainsworth a few months prior for a minor trumped-up infraction, came forward after hearing about the federal investigation. He reported under oath that Ms. Ainsworth had frequently, and with an unusual intensity, asked him detailed hypothetical questions about the community center's complex plumbing and electrical systems, particularly those serving the then-new dialysis unit. She had shown a keen, almost obsessive interest in shut-off valves, control panels, and potential vulnerabilities. He also testified that she had on several occasions borrowed specialized pipe cutters, diagnostic tools, and electrical testing equipment from the HOA's locked maintenance shed tools that were later found during a warranted search of her home by federal agents, meticulously wiped clean and hidden in her garage. She had also, he recalled with a shudder, made several chillingly casual comments to him such as, "It would be such a terrible shame, wouldn't it, if all that noisy, ugly, expensive dialysis equipment just stopped working one day. For good. Permanently." The public confrontation, the denouement, took place at an emergency HOA board meeting, a meeting ostensibly called by the panicked board to discuss the ongoing and disruptive federal investigation and its potential impact on the community's reputation and finances. Ms. Ainsworth was there attempting to project an air of outraged, affronted innocence, even trying to steer the narrative towards blaming the dialysis center's dedicated staff for shoddy maintenance practices and inadequate operational protocols. She even had the audacity to suggest that perhaps the veterans themselves, with their complex medical needs, were somehow responsible for the equipment failures. I let her speak, let her dig her own grave deeper with every lie, every insinuation. Then, when she had finally exhaustedly finished her lengthy self-serving diatribe, I stood up flanked by two stern-faced, imposing federal agents from the FBI's Healthcare Fraud Unit, who had joined our investigation. "Ms. Ainsworth," I began, my voice carrying clearly coldly through the hushed, expectant room. "Eleanor Ainsworth, you are hereby under arrest by federal authorities. The charges include multiple counts of willful and malicious destruction of property on federal interest land, aggravated malicious tampering with life-sustaining medical devices, resulting in significant bodily harm, conspiracy to disrupt essential healthcare services for a protected class, and obstruction of a federal investigation." These charges Ms. Ainsworth carry severe mandatory minimum penalties, including decades in federal prison and substantial crippling financial restitution. Her face, which had been flushed with indignation and self-righteous anger, turned a ghastly mottled white. Her carefully constructed facade of civic concern, of prim respectability, shattered instantly, irrevocably, revealing the cold, venomous, narcissistic malice that lay beneath. This is preposterous!" she shrieked, her voice cracking, her eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for support for an escape. "I am a respected member of this community, a pillar, the HOA treasurer. You can't do this to me." She then rounded on the HOA board. "You need to stop this. This man is abusing his power. He's persecuting me. This HOA will sue the federal government for this outrage." "Ma'am," one of the FBI agents said, stepping forward calmly, his voice devoid of emotion, as he produced a pair of handcuffs. "We have substantial, irrefutable evidence, including detailed witness testimony from former HOA employees, damning forensic findings from the compromised dialysis equipment, and from items recovered from your property. Financial records showing purchases of specific tools and industrial solvents used in these acts of sabotage, and covert surveillance footage, placing you at the scene of these crimes. Please extend your hands. This is over." Ainsworth, her last desperate gambit, to incite the HOA to fight back against the federal government, having failed spectacularly, seemed to crumple. The fight, the arrogance, the sheer, unadulterated evil that had driven her visibly drained out of her, leaving her looking small, old, and pathetic. She began to sob, not tears of remorse, but tears of self-pity and defeated rage as the handcuffs clicked shut. The falling action was as swift as it was decisive. The federal case against Eleanor Ainsworth was airtight, a textbook example of meticulous investigation and overwhelming evidence. The national media seized upon the shocking story, "HOA treasurer sabotages veterans' dialysis machines in twisted NIMBY plot." The public outcry was immense, a torrent of condemnation for Ainsworth, and a wave of sympathy and support for the veterans. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the prospect of spending the rest of her life in federal prison, Ainsworth eventually, after a failed attempt to plead insanity, pleaded guilty to a slightly reduced but still formidable set of charges. She received a sentence that would ensure she would never again pose a threat to any community, any vulnerable individual. Her considerable personal assets were frozen by federal court order, and a significant portion was allocated for full restitution to the affected veterans, for the complete refurbishment and state-of-the-art security upgrade of the dialysis unit, and for the establishment of a new fund to support community-based healthcare initiatives for veterans nationwide. The Willow Glen Homeowners Association was also held severely accountable. My office's investigation revealed that the HOA board, cowed by Ainsworth's domineering personality, and perhaps sharing some of her prejudices, had repeatedly, negligently ignored warnings from the dialysis unit staff about Ms. Ainsworth's increasingly hostile behavior and her obsessive interest in the unit's operations. They had also failed to implement even basic, adequate security measures, despite her known vocal animosity. They faced heavy federal fines for gross negligence, and were forced to enter into a stringent, multi-year consent decree that mandated a complete overhaul of their governance structure, bylaws, and operational protocols, all under strict, ongoing federal oversight. The reign of terror by a prejudiced few within Willow Glen was well and truly over. Nationally, the Ainsworth case became a critically important touchstone for medical facility security and the protection of vulnerable patient populations. My office, the Office of Federal Health Compliance, used the case and the hard lessons learned from it to successfully push for sweeping, urgently needed regulatory reforms. New stringent federal standards were implemented for the physical and cybersecurity of all community-based healthcare facilities, especially those serving vulnerable populations like veterans, the elderly, or the disabled. Manufacturers of critical life-sustaining medical devices like dialysis machines and ventilators were mandated to incorporate more robust, sophisticated tamper-evident features, enhanced cybersecurity protocols, and real-time remote monitoring and diagnostic capabilities. Frank's Law, as the comprehensive legislative package became informally affectionately known in honor of Sergeant Frank Peterson, who became a passionate, articulate advocate for these reforms, also dramatically increased federal penalties for any tampering with medical equipment and created a new, dedicated federal grant program to help small community clinics and healthcare facilities upgrade their security infrastructure and staff training. Frank Peterson, thankfully, made a full and complete recovery, though the experience understandably left him shaken and more cynical about the hidden darkness that can lurk beneath even the most placid suburban surfaces. He became an outspoken, powerful advocate for veterans' healthcare access, safety, and dignity. The dialysis unit at the Willow Glen Veterans Community Center was rebuilt better, brighter, and far more secure than ever before, a vibrant testament to the resilience of the veterans it served and to the broader community that, horrified and shamed by Ainsworth's monstrous actions, finally unequivocally rallied around it with unwavering, passionate support and generosity. The fight had been ugly, the threat terrifyingly real, the potential for tragedy immense. But as I stood in the newly refurbished, brightly lit, and now heavily secured dialysis unit months later, watching Frank Peterson laugh uproariously as he soundly, decisively beat me at chess during his now completely safe and blessedly uninterrupted treatment, I felt a profound, quiet sense of satisfaction of a difficult job well done. The rhythmic, life-sustaining hum of the new advanced dialysis machines was a sweeter, more reassuring sound than ever before. A heinous act of calculated malice had paradoxically, through vigilance and unwavering resolve, led to greater safety, stronger protections, and a renewed sense of shared purpose for countless individuals across the entire nation. And the veterans of Willow Glen, men and women who had served their country with honor and sacrifice, were finally truly receiving the critical care they so richly deserved, in a place where they were respected, valued, and above all, demonstrably, verifiably safe. The monster had been unmasked and caged, and from that darkness, a brighter, more secure future had emerged.